It all started on a rainy Friday night. I had just returned home from work, the kind of day that drags on forever, leaving you drained. Seeking a distraction, I mindlessly scrolled through my phone, the sound of raindrops tapping against the window, providing an eerie backdrop. I've always been fascinated by the strange and unexplained, so it wasn't long before I found myself deep in the darkest corners of Reddit. A particular subreddit caught my eye, a place where users shared their supposed supernatural encounters. Most of the stories were the usual fare, creepy but clearly fictional. But then I stumbled upon a post that was different. The title alone sent a shiver down my spine. I'm not sure I'll survive the night. If I don't, here's my story. Curiosity piqued. I clicked on the post. The story began innocuously enough. A user recounting their move into an old, dilapidated house in a small town, a place that seemed stuck in time. They described the odd occurrences, objects moving on their own, strange noises in the dead of night, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. But as I continued reading, the story took a darker turn. The user claimed they had discovered a hidden room in the attic, a room that was not on the original floor plans. Inside this room, they found something horrifying, an old, dusty mirror covered in strange symbols that looked almost ancient, and a journal with entries in a language they couldn't decipher. The user detailed how after that discovery, their life began to unravel. They described seeing shadows in the mirror that didn't belong to them, hearing whispers that seemed to come from within the walls, and waking up with scratches on their body. The final entry was the most chilling. It's not just the house. It's inside me now. If you're reading this, it's too late. Don't try to find me. Don't try to save me. My heart was racing by the time I finished reading. There were no updates, no replies from the original poster, nothing. Just an empty silence that seemed to resonate through my phone screen. The logical part of my brain told me it was just a story, some clever hoax designed to scare gullible readers. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I was always a skeptic, never one to believe in ghosts or the paranormal, but this post had gotten under my skin in a way that I couldn't explain. I started by searching for any information I could find about the user, but their account was as much of a mystery as the post itself. No prior history, no personal details, just that one chilling story. Then I began digging into the history of the town mentioned in the post, looking for anything that might validate the story. The deeper I went, the more I felt a creeping dread, like I was unraveling a thread that would eventually lead to something I wasn't prepared to face. As I sat there, absorbed in my search, I noticed the atmosphere in my room had changed. The once comforting sound of rain had become a sinister backdrop, and the shadows cast by the dim lamp seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The air felt thick, heavy, with an unseen presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt like the darkness was closing in on me, as if the story I had just read was seeping into my reality. For the first time in years, I felt genuine fear, an irrational, gut-wrenching terror that made me question my sanity. Then, just as I was about to shut down my computer and try to shake off the unease, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The reflection in my screen showed the faint outline of a figure standing behind me, just at the edge of the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned around, but there was nothing there. Just an empty room, the shadows still dancing ominously on the walls. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of reading too many horror stories late at night. But deep down I knew something had shifted. The story I had read was no longer just words on a screen. It had become a part of me, a seed of fear that had taken root and was beginning to grow. And as I sat there, surrounded by the encroaching darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a terrible mistake, that I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Something had changed, and there was no going back. As the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and every creak of the house sent a jolt of fear through my body. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But as the hours passed, it became harder and harder to convince myself of that. Something was wrong, terribly, undeniably wrong, and I was powerless to stop it. The last thing I remember before sleep finally claimed me was the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as I drifted off, I couldn't help but wonder if I would wake up to find that the story had followed me into the real world, that the nightmare had only just begun. After that unsettling night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The post I had read wasn't just an ordinary story. It felt personal, invasive, as if it had latched onto me in some inexplicable way. I knew I had to be careful, but I was already too deep into the mystery to simply walk away. That's when I made the decision to change the names of the people involved. I told myself it was for their protection, to maintain their anonymity. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was a creeping dread that told me the names held power, that they were somehow tied to whatever malevolent force was at play. As I began to alter the details, a strange sensation washed over me, like I was being watched from somewhere just beyond the edge of my awareness. I couldn't pinpoint the source, but the feeling was there, persistent, oppressive, and growing stronger with each passing moment. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the task at hand. I started with the name of the original poster. In the story, they had gone by Alex, but that name now felt tainted, heavy with the weight of the terror they had experienced. I changed it to Sam, hoping that this small alteration would distance me from whatever horror had befallen Alex. But the moment I typed the new name, a chill ran down my spine, as if I had just committed an irreversible act. The air around me grew colder, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and the sense of being watched became almost unbearable. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was letting my imagination run wild, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Next, I changed the name of the town mentioned in the post. The original name, Blackwood, had a dark, foreboding ring to it, a name that seemed to echo with centuries of untold horrors. I swapped it for Ashbury, a name that felt just as ominous but less connected to the story's original dread. As I typed it, I noticed my fingers were trembling, the keys clicking louder than usual in the oppressive silence of the room. With each name, I changed. The feeling of unease intensified. It was as if the very act of altering the story was drawing me deeper into its cursed web. I began to hear faint whispers, just at the edge of my hearing, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably there. They seemed to be coming from the walls, the ceiling, the very air around me, growing louder with each name I erased and replaced. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold sweat forming on my brow as the whispers became more insistent, more menacing. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the task at hand, but the fear was relentless. Every time I looked away from the screen, I had the sensation that something was moving just beyond my line of sight, lurking in the periphery, waiting for the right moment to strike. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and pulse with a life of their own, and the coldness in the air deepened, biting into my skin like icy claws. Then, as I was about to change the final name, the name of the entity that had haunted Alex's story, my computer screen flickered. The power surged for a moment, plunging the room into darkness before the lights sputtered back on. My heart skipped a beat, and I stared at the screen, paralyzed with fear. The entity's name was the one thing I hadn't dared to alter until now, sensing that it held the key to the story's power. But as I looked at the name, written in a language I didn't recognize, I felt a pull, an almost irresistible urge to leave it untouched, to respect the ancient malevolence it represented. But curiosity, that dangerous, insatiable curiosity, got the better of me. With trembling fingers, I began to type a new name, something mundane and harmless, hoping to strip the entity of its power. As I did, the whispers erupted into a cacophony of voices, angry and loud, filling the room with a sound that was both human and inhuman at once. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows closing in around me, suffocating me with their presence. Just as I finished typing the new name, everything stopped. The voices fell silent, the shadows receded, and the coldness in the air vanished as if it had never been there. But the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down on me from all sides, as if the very air had turned against me. For a moment, I sat frozen in my chair, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. And then, slowly, I became aware of a new presence in the room, something unseen, but undeniably there. It was watching me, studying me, and I could feel its anger, its malevolent intent. I had tampered with something ancient, something far beyond my understanding, and now it was aware of me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. By changing the names, by altering the story, I hadn't protected myself. I had done the opposite. I had drawn the entity's attention, made myself a part of its story. And now, there was no going back. The name I had typed, the new name I had given it, was meaningless. It had no power against the force I had unleashed. The entity knew its true name, and now it knew mine. As the night wore on, the presence in the room grew stronger, more oppressive. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unyielding, and the fear that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I knew, without a doubt, that I had made a terrible mistake, and as I sat there surrounded by the darkness, I realized that the story was no longer confined to the screen. It had become real, and it was coming for me. After the harrowing experience of altering the names, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, I knew I had crossed a line, but I couldn't stop myself from diving deeper into the mystery. The post had a grip on me, its words echoing in my mind long after I'd closed the browser. But it wasn't just the post anymore. It felt like something else had attached itself to me, a presence that lurked in the shadows, waiting, watching. Determined to uncover the truth, I started by tracing the clues left behind in the story. The user had mentioned a specific location, a small, forgotten town called Ashbury, now renamed from Blackwood, tucked away in the mountains, far from civilization. The town's history was a tangle of old faded photographs and half-remembered stories of strange happenings, of people disappearing without a trace, of whispers about curses and things that should not be spoken of. As I dug through the layers of history, a pattern began to emerge. This town had been the site of numerous unexplained events, all seemingly connected by an unseen thread. But it wasn't just the town. There was an event, something ominous hinted at in the original post, a gathering that took place decades ago where the townsfolk had tried to summon something or perhaps seal something away. The details were vague, fragmented, as if the very records of what had happened had been deliberately obscured, erased from history. Yet, every mention of this event was accompanied by a growing sense of dread, a feeling that whatever had been done there had left a mark, a scar, on the very fabric of reality. As I delved deeper, strange things began happening. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a faint sound that could be attributed to the creaks of an old house. But then, it escalated. My computer, usually reliable, began to malfunction at the most inconvenient times. Files I had saved would disappear, only to reappear corrupted, filled with gibberish and symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. And the whispers, those insidious whispers, grew louder, more persistent, filling the silence with half-heard words that sent shivers down my spine. One night, as I continued my investigation, I received a direct message on Reddit. It was from a user I didn't recognize, someone with no history, no posts, no comments, just an empty profile. The message was simple: "You're getting too close. Stop before it's too late." My heart skipped a beat as I read the words. Who was this? How did they know what I was doing? Before I could respond, the message vanished, as if it had never existed. I tried to brush it off as a glitch, but the unease settled deep in my gut, an anchor of fear pulling me down. Undeterred, I pressed on, but the more I uncovered, the stranger things became. My internet connection would cut out at the most critical moments. My phone would ring with unknown numbers, only for silence to greet me on the other end. One evening, as I sat alone in the darkened room, a cold breeze swept through, despite the windows being firmly shut. The temperature dropped noticeably, and for the first time I saw it, a shadow darker than the night flickering just beyond the reach of my lamp's light. It was there, and then it wasn't. But the fear it left behind was palpable, suffocating. Then, the messages began. At first they were scattered, random emails from unknown senders, filled with nothing but blank spaces or strange symbols that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking. But they became more frequent, more personal. Photos of my own house, taken from angles I couldn't comprehend, appeared in my inbox, along with short, cryptic messages. "It knows you. You can't hide. It's already here." One night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash from my living room. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept down the hallway, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. As I reached the living room, I saw it. The mirror from my bedroom, the same one that had been securely mounted on the wall, was now shattered on the floor, the pieces scattered like jagged teeth. But it wasn't just the broken glass that terrified me. Written across the fragments, in what looked like my own handwriting, were the words, "Stop digging." Panic surged through me, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. How had the mirror ended up here? Who or what had written those words? I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I fled back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me, but the sense of safety I sought was fleeting. My computer screen, which I had left on, now displayed a message in stark white letters against a black background. "It's too late. You're part of it now." I stared at the screen, my mind racing, but I couldn't make sense of it. My thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and confusion. What had I done? What had I unleashed? I tried to delete the files, to erase any trace of my investigation. But every time I pressed the keys, the message would reappear, mocking me, "You can't escape." The line between the virtual and the real had blurred beyond recognition. Every time I logged on, it felt like I was descending into a nightmare. The digital world twisting into something malevolent, something alive. The shadows around me grew darker, longer, and the whispers became more coherent, more menacing. I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant, and the story was far from over. I had opened a door, and something had come through. Something ancient, something hungry. I realized then that there was no way to turn back, no way to undo what I had done. The mystery I had sought to unravel had ensnared me, and now it was unraveling me in return. The presence I had felt before was no longer content to watch from the shadows. It was here, with me, in the room, in the air I breathed, in the very words I typed. And as I sat there, staring at the flickering screen, I knew that the post, the town, the names, they were all just the beginning. The real horror was only just beginning to reveal itself, and there was no escape from the terror that was now my life. The descent into the unknown had already begun to take its toll on my mind. But it wasn't until that night that the horror truly became real. It was late, well past midnight, when I finally decided to pull myself away from the screen, my eyes burning from hours spent immersed in the online mystery. I felt exhausted, drained in a way that was more than just physical. The room around me seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, a darkness that clung to the walls and pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. But it wasn't until I turned off my computer that the true terror began. As I made my way to bed, the house was unnervingly silent. The usual creaks and groans of the old building were absent, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural, almost suffocating. I climbed into bed, but sleep was elusive. My mind was still racing, replaying the events of the past few days, the cryptic messages, the shadow in the room, the ominous warnings that I couldn't shake. I tried to convince myself that it was all just paranoia, that I was letting the story get to me, but deep down, I knew that something had changed. The silence was oppressive, heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep. But just as I was about to drift off, I felt it. A presence, cold and malevolent, lurking at the edge of my consciousness. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there frozen, listening intently. The silence stretched on, each second dragging out like an eternity, and then I heard it. A faint rustling sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere in the room. I held my breath, straining to hear, every muscle in my body tense with fear. The rustling grew louder, more distinct, like something moving across the floor, dragging itself closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I slowly turned my head to look. At first, there was nothing, just shadows and darkness. But then, in the dim light, I saw it. A figure, indistinct and shrouded in darkness, was standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form barely visible but undeniably there. A shadow within the shadows. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the figure seemed to shift, its head tilting as if it was studying me. The air around it was thick with an unnatural cold, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes your skin crawl. And then, without warning, it moved. Slowly, almost deliberately, it began to glide toward me, its movements unnervingly smooth, as if it wasn't walking, but rather floating just above the ground. Panic surged through me, my mind screaming at my body to move, to run, but I was paralyzed, trapped by the sheer terror of the thing that was now looming over me. The figure stopped inches from my face, and in that moment, I could feel its presence. Dark, ancient, filled with a malice so intense it made my blood run cold. It leaned in closer, and I could feel its breath, icy and foul, as it whispered something unintelligible, a sound that was more like a growl than a voice. My heart was racing, my body trembling uncontrollably as I desperately tried to make sense of what was happening. But there was no logic here, no explanation that could rationalize the horror that was now staring down at me with eyes that I couldn't see, but could feel boring into my soul. The figure's whispering grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once, filling my head with a cacophony of fear and despair. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty, the oppressive presence vanished as if it had never been there. But the cold lingered, a deep, bone-chilling cold that left me shivering under the covers. I was left staring at the ceiling, my mind reeling, my body drenched in cold sweat. The silence had returned, but it was different now. No longer a simple absence of sound, but a void, a nothingness that seemed to swallow up everything, leaving only the echo of that terrible whisper in its wake. I couldn't sleep after that. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside sent a jolt of fear through me, my mind conjuring images of the shadowy figure returning, standing silently at the foot of my bed waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it had been a dream, a figment of my exhausted imagination. But the memory of that cold, malevolent presence was too real, too vivid. As the hours dragged on, I realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever I had seen, whatever had been in my room that night, was real. And it was just the first step into a darkness that I had unwittingly invited into my life. The boundary between my world and the one I'd been exploring online had been breached, and now there was no turning back. The terror I had been reading about, the horror that had once been confined to the pages of a Reddit post, was now in my home, in my life, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. As dawn finally broke, casting a pale light through the windows, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in that house any longer, but even as I packed my things, I knew that leaving wouldn't be enough. The terror that had visited me in the night wasn't bound to the house. It was bound to me, and no matter where I went, it would follow. The shadows, the whispers, the cold, they were all just the beginning, and as I walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figure was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next opportunity to make itself known. Leaving the house didn't bring the relief I'd hoped for. Instead, it marked the beginning of something far worse, a descent into a nightmare that I couldn't escape. The terror that had started as an online mystery had now seeped into every corner of my life, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. No matter where I went, the feeling of being watched never left me, a constant reminder that the horror I had unleashed was far from over. It started with the shadows. At first, they were just a flicker at the edge of my vision, a brief, unsettling moment that I could almost dismiss. But soon, they became more frequent, more tangible. Every time I entered a room, I could feel them, lurking just out of sight, shifting and moving as if they had a life of their own. It wasn't long before I began to see them more clearly, dark, amorphous shapes that seemed to ooze from the walls, stretching out toward me before dissolving back into the darkness. They were never fully formed, never distinct enough to confront, but their presence was undeniable, and with each encounter, my fear grew. The whispers, too, became more persistent. What had once been faint, indistinguishable murmurs had now grown into a constant background noise, an eerie chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their tone urgent and insistent like a warning or a command that I couldn't decipher. Sometimes, late at night, I could hear them more clearly. Fragments of words, half-sentences that sent chills down my spine. They called my name, whispered threats, promises of doom that left me trembling in my bed, too terrified to sleep. But the worst was the feeling of being watched. It was no longer just a vague sensation. It was a physical, oppressive force that weighed on me at all times. I could feel eyes on me, cold and unblinking, following my every move. In the darkness, I could sense them more acutely, as if the shadows themselves were alive, filled with a malevolent intelligence that was constantly observing, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside felt like a precursor to something terrible, a harbinger of the horror that was always just a breath away. One night, as I sat in my new apartment, trying to distract myself with the TV, the power suddenly went out. The screen flickered off, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, the only source of light in the pitch-black room. The air was thick with tension, the silence oppressive, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. And then, in the faint glow of my phone, I saw them. Handprints, dozens of them, smeared across the walls in dark, sticky streaks. They hadn't been there before, of that I was certain. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, the outlines of fingers stretching impossibly long, like claws reaching out toward me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the handprints, unable to move, unable to look away. And then, as I watched, they began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they dragged themselves across the walls, leaving a trail of darkness in their wake. The shadows deepened, coalescing into a shape. A figure, tall and imposing, stepping out from the wall as if it had been hiding there all along. It was the same figure I had seen that night in my old house, the same dark presence that had haunted my dreams. Only this time, it was real and it was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the figure. The shadows seemed to stretch out toward me, pulling at my clothes, my hair, as if trying to drag me back into the darkness. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, almost deafening, as if they were coming from within my own mind. They were urging the figure on, commanding it to take me, to pull me into whatever hellish dimension it had come from. In a blind panic, I ran for the door, but the moment my hand touched the doorknob, it burned, searing my skin with an intense heat. I screamed in pain, yanking my hand back, only to see the shadows creeping up my arm, leaving a trail of icy cold in their wake. The figure was almost upon me now, its form barely visible but terrifying in its sheer presence. It loomed over me, its eyes, if it had any, locked onto mine, with a malevolence so intense it felt like it was burning into my soul. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran to the window and threw it open, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. Without thinking, I climbed onto the ledge and jumped, crashing into the bushes below. Pain shot through my body as I hit the ground, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fled into the night. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, until my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the pavement, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I looked back at the apartment, expecting to see the figure standing in the window, watching me. But there was nothing, just darkness. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that I had escaped, that I was safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. The horror wasn't bound to a place, a house, or an apartment. It was bound to me. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would follow. The shadows, the whispers, the cold, they were a part of me now, and they were growing stronger. As I sat there, trembling in the cold night air, I realized that the figure, the presence that had haunted me, wasn't just some malevolent spirit or ghost. It was something far worse, something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting for someone like me, someone curious, someone foolish enough to seek out the unknown. And now that it had found me, there was no escape. The horror would continue to escalate, and the figure would keep coming closer and closer until there was nothing left of me but shadows and whispers. The next day, I knew I had to do something, anything, to break the cycle, to rid myself of the darkness that was consuming my life. But every attempt to find help, to find answers, only led me deeper into the mystery, deeper into the terror. And all the while, the figure was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting, watching. The handprints, the whispers, the cold, they were just the beginning. The real horror was still to come, and I knew with a sickening certainty that when it did, there would be no escape. The realization that the terror was bound to me, that it had become an inescapable part of my life, was a weight that crushed any remaining hope I had. But despite the overwhelming fear, a twisted sense of determination began to take hold. I couldn't just sit back and let this darkness consume me. I had to understand what was happening, why it had chosen me, and if there was any way to stop it. That's when I decided to go back to the beginning, to the original post, the one that had started it all. I returned to Reddit, to the post that had drawn me into this nightmare. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the comments, looking for anything I might have missed, any clue that could offer a way out. But as I read through the responses, one in particular caught my eye. A comment that I hadn't noticed before, buried deep within the thread. It was from a user with no profile picture, no history, just a single post, and it simply said, "The truth lies in the journal. Seek it out if you dare." The journal. My mind raced as I remembered the mention of a journal in the original story. A book filled with indecipherable writing and strange symbols. I had dismissed it at the time as just another creepy detail, but now it seemed to hold the key to everything. I had to find it. But the thought of actually tracking down that cursed book filled me with dread. If it was real, if it was still out there, then it was undoubtedly dangerous, the source of the malevolent force that was now haunting me. After days of searching, I finally found a lead. The town of Ashbury, where the original story had taken place, was real. It was a small, isolated community, nearly forgotten by time, nestled deep within a forest. The town's history was shrouded in mystery, rumors of strange rituals, disappearances, and an overwhelming sense of unease that clung to the place like a fog. The journal, according to local legend, had been kept by a man named Elias Harlow, one of the town's founding members who was said to have dabbled in the occult, using the book to commune with dark forces. I knew I had to go there, to find the journal and uncover the truth. But as I made my way to Ashbury, a sense of foreboding grew within me, like a dark cloud hanging over my soul. The drive was long and silent, the road winding through dense, shadowy forests that seemed to close in around me the closer I got to the town. By the time I arrived, night had fallen and the town was eerily quiet, as if it had been abandoned long ago. But I could feel it, the same oppressive presence that had haunted me for weeks. It was here, stronger than ever, and it was watching. I made my way to the address I'd found in an old town record, a dilapidated house on the outskirts of Ashbury, half hidden by overgrown trees and vines. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the house itself seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. Every step I took toward the front door was like walking through quicksand, the atmosphere growing heavier, more oppressive with each passing moment. I could feel the darkness pressing in around me, urging me to turn back, to leave while I still could. But I'd come too far to stop now. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that stretched into darkness. The house was deathly silent, the air stale and unmoving. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and slowly made my way through the house, my flashlight casting long, sinister shadows on the walls. Every corner seemed to hide something, every creak and rustle making my heart pound in my chest. The fear was palpable, a living thing that wrapped itself around me, making it hard to breathe. Finally, I found it. The journal. It was lying on a dusty table in what must have once been a study, the pages yellowed with age, the cover cracked and worn. But as I reached out to touch it, a jolt of fear shot through me, and I hesitated. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows darker, as if the house itself was trying to warn me away. But I couldn't stop now. I had to know the truth. With trembling hands, I opened the journal, the pages crackling under my fingers. The writing was almost impossible to read, a chaotic jumble of letters and symbols that made no sense. But as I flipped through the pages, one entry caught my eye. It was different from the rest, written in a hurried, frantic hand, and as I read the words, a chill ran down my spine. They told me it was a simple ritual, a way to connect with the spirits of the forest, to seek their wisdom. But they lied. It was not the spirits they called forth, but something far darker, something ancient and hungry. I see it now, in the shadows, in the corners of my vision. It watches, it waits. The others are gone, taken by the darkness, and soon I will be too. I tried to stop it, to undo what we have done, but it is too powerful. The journal is the key. It holds the name, the true name of the thing we summoned. But to speak it, to even know it, is to invite death. If you are reading this, it is already too late. The darkness has found you. You cannot escape. I stared at the page, my hands shaking, the weight of the revelation crushing down on me. The figure, the presence that had been haunting me, it wasn't just a ghost or a demon. It was something far worse, something beyond human comprehension, something that had been unleashed by a ritual gone wrong. And now it was bound to the journal, to the town, to me, the name. The journal held the name of the entity, the thing that had been tormenting me, but I couldn't bring myself to look for it. The fear was too great, the knowledge too dangerous, but as I stood there, frozen with terror, I realized that I didn't have a choice. The darkness was closing in, the shadows in the room growing longer, more menacing, as if they were alive, reaching out for me. The whispers were back, louder now, almost deafening, filling my head with their insistent, maddening chorus. I had to find the name. It was the only way to stop it, to end the nightmare that had consumed my life. But the moment I turned the page, I knew I had made a mistake. The name was there, scrawled across the page in blood-red ink, a word that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. But as I stared at it, the room around me seemed to dissolve, the walls melting away into darkness, leaving me alone in a vast, empty void. The figure appeared before me, more solid now, more real, its eyes burning with an unholy light. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were urging the figure on, pushing it closer to me. I tried to speak, to call out the name, but the words caught in my throat, choked by the fear that gripped me. The figure loomed over me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating, and in that moment, I knew that I had lost. The name had power, but it wasn't mine to wield. It belonged to the darkness, and by seeking it out, I had sealed my fate. The last thing I remember, before the darkness swallowed me whole, was the figure reaching out, its hand closing around my throat, and the whispers, those terrible, insidious whispers, filling my mind with a single, terrifying thought: you are mine now. When I awoke, I was no longer in the house. I was back in my apartment, the journal lying open on the floor beside me. But the name, the word that had nearly destroyed me, was gone, the page blank, as if it had never been written. The shadows were still there, lurking in the corners, the whispers still echoing in my mind. But the figure was gone, for now. But I knew it wasn't over. The journal was still with me, the darkness still a part of me, and the terror that had begun with a simple Reddit post was far from finished. The truth had been revealed, but it had come at a cost, and as I sat there staring at the blank page, I realized that I was trapped, caught in a web of horror that I could never escape. The darkness had found me, and no matter what I did, it would never let me go. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia, each moment more suffocating than the last. The journal now sat on my desk, an object of dread that I couldn't bear to touch, but couldn't bring myself to destroy. The darkness that had attached itself to me was growing stronger, more tangible, as if feeding off my fear. I could feel it constantly, pressing against my mind, whispering insidious thoughts, and making every shadow, every whisper of wind, a reminder that something was coming. The figure had not appeared again, but its presence was a constant, lingering threat, like a predator toying with its prey before the final strike. I knew the time was running out. The entity, whatever it was, had no intention of letting me go. It was drawing closer, waiting for the perfect moment to make its move. The fear was maddening, a relentless pressure that made it hard to think, to breathe. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every second of the day consumed by the terror that had become my reality. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own home, haunted by the knowledge that the end was near. Then, one night, the climax of my nightmare began. It started with a power outage, the lights flickering and then dying, plunging my apartment into complete darkness. The silence that followed was absolute, so thick it was almost a physical presence, pressing down on me from all sides. The air grew cold, colder than I had ever felt, the kind of cold that sank deep into my bones and made my teeth chatter. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood, coming from the direction of the journal. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my phone, the only source of light I had left. The screen flickered on, casting a weak glow over the room, but the shadows seemed to swallow the light, growing deeper, darker. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it was right next to me, as if whatever was making the noise was just inches away. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone, the light revealing the journal, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze, though the air was still. And then the scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that sent a chill down my spine. I slowly opened the journal, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages. The writing was the same chaotic jumble as before, but now the symbols seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, a disjointed chorus of voices all speaking at once, none of it making any sense. But then, amidst the chaos, I heard it. The name. The name I had discovered before. The name that had almost destroyed me. It was there, hidden in the whispers, repeated over and over again, as if calling to me, daring me to speak it. The air grew colder still, the darkness pressing in on me, suffocating me. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the shadows stretching out toward me, long, twisted fingers of darkness that reached for my throat. I could feel it, the presence, the entity. It was here, with me, in the room. It had been waiting, watching, and now it was ready to take me. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing, and I knew that this was it. The moment I had been dreading, the moment the darkness would consume me. I tried to speak, to call out the name, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by the terror that gripped me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging me to speak, to give in to the darkness. But I couldn't. My body was frozen, locked in place by fear, as the shadows closed in around me, their touch icy cold, burning against my skin. The figure appeared then, stepping out from the darkness, more solid, more real than ever before. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form indistinct but terrifying in its sheer presence. Its eyes, burning with an unholy light, locked onto mine. And in that moment, I felt the full weight of its malevolence, a darkness so deep, so ancient that it crushed any hope I had left. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating, and I could feel its breath, cold and foul, as it whispered my name. The shadows wrapped around me, pulling me toward the figure, toward the darkness that awaited me. My mind screamed in terror, every instinct telling me to run, to fight, but my body refused to obey. The figure reached out, its hand closing around my throat, and I felt the life being squeezed out of me, the darkness pulling me under, drowning me in its depths. In a final, desperate act, I forced myself to speak, to call out the name. The word tore itself from my throat, a guttural sound that echoed in the darkness, and for a brief moment the figure hesitated. The shadows recoiled, the whispers silenced, and I felt a flicker of hope, a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness. But then, the figure's grip tightened, its eyes flaring with rage, and the darkness surged forward, crashing over me like a tidal wave. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the figure's eyes, burning with a hatred so intense it felt like it would consume the world. The last thing I heard was the whisper of the name, repeated over and over again, a taunt, a curse, a promise of what was to come. And then there was nothing. The darkness took me, pulled me under, and I was lost, consumed by the terror that had been waiting for me all along. But even in the depths of the darkness, I could feel it, an ancient, malevolent force, a hunger that could never be sated. The figure was there, watching, waiting, and I knew that this was only the beginning. The darkness had taken me, but it was not finished. The terror would continue, the shadows would grow, and the figure would keep coming, closer and closer, until there was nothing left of me but whispers and darkness. The name had been spoken, but its power was not mine. It belonged to the darkness, and the darkness would never let me go. When I awoke, it was not in the dark void I had feared, but back in my apartment, lying on the cold floor with the journals splayed open beside me. The room was bathed in the pale light of dawn. casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and reach for me, even in the dimness of early morning. For a moment I dared to hope that it had all been a nightmare, a terrible hallucination brought on by stress and fear. But the deep, lingering cold in my bones and the faint echoes of whispers in the back of my mind told me the truth. What had happened was real, and it was far from over. The figure was gone, but its presence was still palpable, like a stain on the air that no amount of light or warmth could erase. Every corner of the room felt wrong, like the darkness was still lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I tried to shake off the feeling, to tell myself that I had survived, that I had somehow managed to break free from the entity's grasp. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The name I had spoken had momentarily driven it back, but it had not been banished. It was still out there, still watching, and it would return. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the shadows twisting and writhing with a life of their own. I packed what little I could carry and fled, not caring where I went as long as it was far from that place. But no matter how far I ran, the terror followed. The whispers never truly left me. They were quieter now, almost imperceptible, but always there, a constant reminder of what I had unleashed. The figure didn't appear again, not in the way it had before, but I could feel it. In every shadow that seemed too dark, in every cold gust of wind that cut through the warmest day, I could sense its presence, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. It was patient, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. I had become its prey, and it was in no rush to finish the hunt. I moved from place to place, never staying anywhere for long, always looking over my shoulder, always feeling that same oppressive weight in the air. The nightmares were relentless. Each night, I would relive the moment when the figure had taken hold of me, feel its icy grip around my throat, hear the whispers growing louder and louder until they drowned out my thoughts. But the worst part was the sense of inevitability, the knowledge that no matter how far I ran, how much I tried to forget, the darkness would always find me. Months passed, in a blur of fear and exhaustion, my life a shadow of what it had once been. I avoided people, afraid that the entity might reach them through me, might spread its malevolence to anyone who got too close. Loneliness became my only companion, the silence of isolation preferable to the horror that stalked me. But even in solitude, I could not escape the creeping dread that filled every moment of my waking life. One night, after weeks of restless, haunted sleep, I had a dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. I found myself back in Ashbury, standing in front of the dilapidated house where I had first found the journal. The night was silent, unnaturally so, the air thick with the same oppressive cold that I'd come to dread. The house loomed before me, a dark silhouette against the starless sky, its windows like empty eyes staring down at me. I knew I shouldn't go inside, that whatever awaited me there was far worse than anything I had faced before, but my feet moved on their own, drawing me closer and closer to the door. Inside, the house was exactly as I remembered it, every detail etched into my mind with horrifying clarity. The shadows were deeper, darker, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The whispers began as soon as I crossed the threshold, soft at first, but growing louder with each step I took. They were angry now, filled with malice and hate, their words a jumbled mess that I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a deep, primal fear. I found myself drawn to the study, the room where I had discovered the journal, and where the entity had first made its presence known. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and there, in the center of the room, stood the figure. It was more solid now, more real. Its features still obscured by shadows, but its presence undeniable. Its eyes, those burning, hate-filled eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt the same overwhelming terror that I had felt that first night. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around it seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as if urging it to act. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I stood frozen in place, unable to look away. And then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised its hand, pointing directly at me. The whispers stopped, the silence that followed more terrifying than any sound I'd ever heard. The figure's hand began to close, its fingers curling into a fist, and as it did, I felt a crushing pressure in my chest, like my heart was being squeezed in a vice. The pain was excruciating, and I fell to my knees, clutching my chest as the darkness closed in around me, the figure's grip tightening with every passing second. I awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart racing and my breath coming in ragged gasps. The dream, if it had been a dream, felt too real, too vivid, and the fear that had gripped me was still there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The darkness had come for me again, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it made its final move. Days passed, each one dragging on in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I was too afraid to sleep, too afraid to close my eyes and face the figure again. The darkness was relentless, always there, always waiting, and the knowledge that it could strike at any moment was a weight I could barely carry. I was living on borrowed time, and I knew it. Then, one night, it happened. I was sitting in a small, dimly lit motel room, staring blankly at the TV, trying to drown out the whispers that had become a constant background noise in my mind. The air was thick with tension, the shadows in the room seeming to grow longer, deeper, as the minutes ticked by. And then, the lights flickered, the power surging before the room was plunged into darkness. I froze, the fear gripping me with an intensity that was almost unbearable. The air grew cold, the same bone-chilling cold that I had come to associate with the entity's presence. I could feel it, the figure, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to make a move. The whispers were louder now, clearer, and I could hear my name being called over and over again in that same insidious, malevolent tone. I knew what was coming, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The darkness was closing in, the shadows reaching out for me, pulling me down into the abyss. The figure was there, watching, waiting, and I knew that this time there would be no escape. The terror had come full circle, and the end was inevitable. As the darkness swallowed me whole, the last thing I saw was the figure's eyes, burning with that same unholy light, filled with a hatred so deep it defied comprehension. The last thing I heard was the whisper of my name, repeated over and over again. A final taunt, a final curse, and then there was nothing. The darkness had won. The entity had taken me, just as it had taken so many before me, and now I was part of it, a whisper in the shadows, a ghost in the darkness. The terror, the fear, the horror that had consumed my life was now my eternity. The figure had claimed me, and there was no escape, not in this life or the next. I was lost, forever bound to the darkness, a prisoner of the entity I'd foolishly sought to understand. The journal, the cursed book that had started it all, lay untouched on the floor of the motel room, its pages blank, its power spent, but the darkness was not gone. It would find another, as it always had, as it always would. The figure, the entity, was eternal, a shadow that would never be banished, a terror that would never be quenched. And so, the story ends as it began, with a name, a curse, and a darkness that waits patiently for its next victim, for the next fool to seek out the truth, to open the door and let the terror in. The nightmare is eternal, and the darkness will never rest.